Shalom, everyone. Welcome to our first episode going over 1 Timothy and maybe the Pastoral Epistles. So forgive me if there's some birds in the background or some birds in the background. We are doing this somewhat outside. So the Lord told me to do this. One night I recommended it on social media, and so many messaged me with revelations and the answer they received from reading it for themselves. So here we are. This is 1 Timothy, and it is part of the Pastoral Epistles as a whole, and it seems like an often neglected book, except for what I call doctrinal drive-bys and taking verses out, which is fine, but the book themselves seem somewhat neglected. So as we know, these are almost the final letters by Paul. 2 Timothy is obviously the last letter to him, but it's not just that. It's not just a personal letter, even though that aspect is pretty important. We're reading about Paul's last letters going out, and as one commentator we will draw from Yarborough in the Pillar New Testament commentary series, he quotes Odin and says, "The pastorals contain valuable counsel not found elsewhere in the New Testament on how to administer and teach in the church." End quote. And that's a really good point, because the apostle is writing to Timothy and then in Titus, and on how to not only exact administration of the body, but how the church should function, what it should look like. And therefore, it's deeply relevant and very valuable in our present day with our countless denominations and church structures, etc. And the question will be asked, what is the church supposed to look like? How is it to function? These are things that are interesting, and that's why I think it's necessary to kind of go over this book, because these letters are truly written to us, especially as Paul speaks of commandments to all the churches everywhere. He speaks of, the last days and the later times, and therefore it applies to us. We should definitely be really interested in this. And granted, all epistles apply to us, but Timothy and Titus seem to be in a more intimate way. So in a lot of scholarship, the Pastoral Epistles authorship is actually pretty disputed. It's suggested that it is a pseudo work, which was common in the day. Basically, people would use more popular people's names to get their work out there. And nowadays, we would see that as plagiarism and impostoring someone. But back then, seems to be accepted for whatever reason that is. So a lot of times it's attributed to a later work, and basically it's a forgery. We kind of reject this notion, and we will go forward assuming that it is Paul writing this. It's quite a task to pull off, to produce such a personal and authoritative letter from famous apostle Paul to Timothy, who's also a well-known and lived longer teacher of Ephesus, which was a pretty big church hub. In scholarship, redaction criticism, which is the idea of the scriptures that we currently have being edited, it's pretty popular, and it has its place. It does, but I generally reject it. I believe that God inspired the scriptures, and that He kept them and preserved them for us to have. And at one point, you do have to ask yourself in academia, whose side are these people on exactly? So we also reject Pauline rejection, if you would. So a lot of people, especially in the Messianic world, reject Paul as an apostle, say he's a false apostle, stuff like that. And that's an issue, but I think that stems from a few things. Primarily, I think it stems from people misunderstanding Paul. Peter gives us this warning. Paul was a Hebrew of Hebrews, to the Gentiles, speaking of massive mysteries. He's highly intelligent, taught at the feet of Gamaliel. He, surpassed all his peers in the Jewish religion. He's writing to multiple different cultures. So he's going to be hard to understand as it is. Just with each letter, you have to stop and think, and this is something we'll do here. Okay, who's he writing to? And when he's writing to the Corinthians, that's a much, much different culture than when he's writing to the Romans or when he's writing to the Ephesians. So these things have to be considered a bit. And if you want to read, and Paul's just difficult here, if you want to read a funny book, it's Paul Behaving Badly by Richards and O'Brien. And it gets into a lot of funny things, how the early church warns Paul, hey, don't go to Jerusalem. And they warned him in the spirit. So they're not just, giving a word without actually having some authority. They're doing in the spirit. Paul says, no, I'll go there. He said, no, you're going to get in trouble if you go there. Goes there, promptly is arrested. That's something they go over. It's funny. Paul was, I think, hard-headed. And I think that was used for God's gain. But he's an interesting character, and it's difficult to quite understand him. But the more you read Paul's letters, the more you're going to understand who he is. So moving on, it's typically asserted to be dated between 62 to 65 AD. Between his first imprisonment in Rome and the second, when writing to Timothy when he was in his second imprisonment. In the earliest papyri we do have, like the old manuscripts, basically is P133, and that's from the 3rd century. So that is pretty late to put for dating Timothy. However, we know he was mentioned by Irenaeus and against heresies, which we'll be discussing later. Polycarp and Ignatius, other church fathers. And these are very early, so they situate the letters to be Pauline as well as to be earlier. It's included in the Muratorian canon, which was in years 170 to 180. And it's pretty clearly alluded to with literary connections in Clement, Ignatius to Ephesians, Polycarp to Philippians, other letters. So I think we have enough evidence, or comparable to other epistles and gospels, for an earlier date of Timothy. I do believe we do, and we find much of the church referring back to Timothy in some regard, whether it's just a slight literary connection or if it's an exact quote. I think we have enough evidence to substantiate the claim to make that it was Pauline, it was authentic. Eusebius says it was, authentic, and that's pretty substantial. But as I commented earlier, there aren't too many resources, but there are some, and we'll be drawing from some commentaries throughout this episode series, I suppose you'd say. So for readers who want to, listeners who want to, read some other sources, some helpful things are, I mentioned earlier, Robert Yarborough's, that's of the Pillar New Testament series. It's relatively technical, but it's pretty good. It's a pretty comprehensive overview. Then we have George Knight's, that's the New International Greek Testament Commentary series, NIGTC. That's pretty technical. You need to have a relatively good handle on Greek. Similarly would be William or Bill Mounce's in the World Bible Commentary, Philip Towner of New International Commentary on New Testament, that's NICNT series, Andreas Kotzenberger from EBTC, Evangelical Biblical Theology Commentary series, Donald Guthrie, Tyndale New Testament Commentary series, Raymond Collins, New Testament Library series, Robert Wall, Richard Steele's The Two Horizons New Testament Commentary series, and there's plenty more books and articles on the topic, such as N.T. Wright's. I think that's for Paul for Everyone. So there is some material on it and resources, just not as much as you'd find from other books. And I don't think we're going to be doing anything novel here or anything profound that no one else has done, but I wanted to go over this because it is a really, really good and powerful series for us to go over, especially as it relates to the modern church now. I think a lot of our perspectives will be changed by just kind of simply reading the scriptures. So To begin, we'll be reading out of the English Standard Version. That's ESV. They put it as it's a translation I typically prefer. As they say, they're an essentially literal translation, but it's elegant, formal, not without its problems. But no translation is perfect. We can't take something from Koine Greek from 2,000 years ago into modern English. We will attempt to endeavor to give a more accurate modern rendering, but it's difficult, and oftentimes word studies are pretty tricky to try to get the full meaning out of, because in translation you're really going for a sentence, the whole thought. And we've gone over this in the Bible study a little bit, but as Michael Heiser put it, the best translation is the one you will read consistently. There is no such thing as a perfect translation. Everything gets lost in it to some degree. But we will be sticking with the ESV with, I imagine, most of this podcast series in general. So beginning in 1 Timothy 1:1, Paul, an apostle of Messiah Yeshua, by command of God our Savior and of Messiah Yeshua our hope. To Timothy, my true child in the faith, grace, mercy, and peace from God the Father and Messiah Yeshua our Lord. So, opening, we'll see Paul usually introduces people in this way. And the way Paul opens up his letters is actually pretty commonplace in his time. Greetings from me and you and this and that. It's funny how when we look at these manuscripts and papyri of the first century in Greek letters, it's pretty similar to how Paul basically opens up his letters. So the first thing we read is Paul, an apostle of Messiah by command of God. So our first word for apostle is apostolos, and that is simply a messenger or a herald. And then our second, which is interesting, is kat epitagein, which would be by commandment, commission, injunction, something along those lines. So Paul was constantly defending his apostleship. While we'll go over in this further episodes, there seems to suggest that there are multiple apostles, yet the 12 are elevated, of whom belongs. He's consistently claiming equal authority to the other apostles, even elders like James, the brother of Yeshua. And he says of himself in 1 Corinthians 15:8, an apostle of one untimely born. So Paul was added to the, let's say, the supreme apostles, if you would, as one unto the Gentiles. And a lot of people say, okay, well, there's 12 tribes and there's 12 thrones, 12 apostles. Judas was replaced by lots, to Matthias in Acts 1:26. What gives? Well, I think people get hung up on this because it's the same idea of the 12 tribes and all of the nations. I don't see this as really a big deal. On the road to Damascus, Yeshua visits Paul, commissions him, commands him, as an apostle to the Gentiles, thus fulfilling the need for someone to be part of these supreme apostles to have seen Yeshua in person. So, by command enforces the notion of Paul being an apostle by the triune God's commissioning, as this word is used in the sense of commandment, particularly that from God. 1 Corinthians 7:6, 2 Corinthians 8:8, areas where it's command. He's defending his apostleship just like he does a lot in Galatians and Corinthians. 2 Corinthians, it's a little different. That's where he uses famous or infamous term of super apostles. These super apostles. He's defending his apostleship because there's a lot of fake people going out there, as we'll see, and also a lot of people. I mean, he went around and slaughtered the early church, and a lot of people got on him. I'd imagine that didn't really leave him. We'd like to think that the early church acted like that, but then, everyone's still humans. So he was constantly defending it for the sake of God, too. Paul was humble. He comes off arrogant at times when he's confident in the gospel. So, reading on, he says, to Timothy, my true son, some translations will render this. These two words are genesio and takno. So genesio is sincere or genuine, true, and takno is son, particularly a child. So it's interesting, doesn't use child, usually renders son. Timothy was obviously not Paul's true child, like his actual son. And we read, in piste, in faith. So, my true son in the faith. In Acts 16:1 and in verse 3, we read that Timothy's mother was Jewish, father was Greek. So here is where Paul basically took him under his wing and in a way brought him up, and Timothy became his spiritual son, something that we have nowadays in the church. And Timothy, he's a genuine child, a trustworthy one. Just as the gospel had been entrusted to Paul, in verse 12 we'll read, so has it to Timothy in verse 18. The introduction is, we have charis, eleos, and erene. So these are respectively grace, mercy, and peace. Paul usually introduces letters with grace and peace. A form of grace, charin, was typical in greeting in Greek letters, similar to greetings. Agree. It's cool though how we see this, because it's typically assumed that Paul is saying grace in the literal sense of what we think of grace with God, but also peace, erene, as in shalom. So representing both Jewish and Gentile audiences. In his letters to Timothy and Titus, though, exclusively, he includes mercy and elos, which is compassion, loving mercy. It's unclear why, either due to the personal nature of them, both in audience and relationship. Timothy and Titus were sons of Paul, or some suggest due to them being leaders and needing mercy, especially for the things, appointing elders and all that. They do need a good bit of mercy. So, this is what some people think, and no one really knows. We just see a more intimate approach here between the two. And I think that's pretty interesting to look at. So reading on to verse 3, we see, as I urged you when I was going to Macedonia, remain at Ephesus so that you may charge certain persons not to teach any different doctrine. So we read immediately that Paul has urged, or he has implored Timothy to remain at Ephesus while he was going to Macedonia, which is over in Greece. Ephesus is in Asia Minor, which is on the right, just some 100 miles above Jerusalem. And we read that this is past tense. So Paul left Timothy off at some point. You're stronger when you're divided and you cover more ground. And Paul has since this point left off. And we would imagine the imploring, it was the last time that Paul and Timothy were together, and presumably until the kingdom. This might have been the last time that they were together. And it was the Lord's will for Timothy to stay in Ephesus and Paul to keep moving on. So our first word, this charge, is paragaleus. And it's an authoritative statement of command. It's less than that of instruction. It's not quite a rebuke. It's authoritatively giving a command. It's used by Yeshua when he banished the unclean spirit, Luke 8:29. We would read it in a negative or forceful manner due to the negative association with different doctrine, especially the negative me, or not. The second word is tessin, and it's plural. It's typically rendered as certain persons, but we would just read it as just some people, certain persons, some. Doesn't particularly matter. And then we read me heterodidaskalin, which is to teach differently, particularly different than what is typically taught. So, paragales tessin heterodidaskalin is a good way to kind of read this would be, forcefully tell these some to not teach contrary to sound doctrine, to what we've been teaching. So it must be it must be compared, this new doctrine, this new teaching, to something that is already being taught, this sound doctrine that we'll go over later. Paul's is given a charge for Timothy to remain at Ephesus in order that he may essentially guard the deposit and trust him, keep the church straight in a way. Keep on at Ephesus. And this confirms Timothy's authority, as we will see, one entrusted to be a shepherd. He is to charge some who are coming in and teaching contrary to sound doctrine, and was the orthodox interpretation of both the gospel and the scriptures. So immediately we have some big issues going on in this area. And we go over to some detail in the second episode of Bible Study, where Ephesus was a huge religious hub. Big hub. It was a big social melting pot. It was estimated at 200 to 300,000 people in this day, which is a lot in that day. We have the cult of Artemis, Diana there, and that's something that's outlined in Acts 19. It's a very large population. It was a port city on Asia Minor, on the coast, on the Mediterranean. So we had a lot of people coming from all over the place. We had people coming from Italy, Rome, from Greece, from northern Mediterranean, presumably from Egypt, areas in Africa. We have people coming from the east, Mesopotamia, all of this, Babylon, all of those areas. Everyone is kind of coming here as this hub. There was a lot of trade going on, a lot of religious groups, a lot of different settings. And this is important whenever we're reading a book. We need to step back and look at what the setting is. What is the context? What's the cultural context? And it's going to allow us to really get into the book and more accurately read what exactly is going on. So in the coming episodes, as much as I'd love to do this verse by verse, it's a little bit difficult. We'll have to hop around a little bit. But I will follow a structure of going verse by verse, passage by passage, splitting it up however long it takes. This will be a shorter episode. I want the other episodes to be a bit longer to kind of pack in the material we have to. But I want to set this up. We can kind of see what we're looking at. And we have this charge. So whatever we should be building off of here is that we have a situation of some urgency. We have Timothy in a place of authority, having to guard the church. And then when we start seeing different aspects of what he's teaching, we'll see that this is flowing out of this need of having the church be this pillar of the truth. So these letters are very important. I think it's good to start here. Try to relate this to our lives. And I think we'll learn a lot. I think we'll learn how we should be seeing the church operate. We go over teaching and leaders, overseers, all kinds of things, and it's a packed book. And with the way the church is nowadays, it's just kind of wonky. So referring back to these letters, taking them as authoritative, taking them as Pauline, as genuine, as early, will help lead us and guide us into interpreting and understanding what he's saying pretty well. So some of the things we'll do are a little deeper. Some passages will kind of just skim on by, but I think this is a good place. We'll see if we'll get into, I would like to at least do 2 Timothy. That would be my goal. Not sure if we'll do Titus. I'll draw from Titus somewhat, but I think too many people draw from Titus and force the meaning on there. I mean, Crete, which is an island, which is where Titus was, is totally different than Ephesus. And while the Greco-Roman world was relatively similar, since it's all kind of blended under the Roman Empire, it was still different. Still had its very own unique culture. It's like America is the same, but you don't compare Texas and New York. I mean, I guess a lot of New York people are moving to Texas, but you don't compare the two. It just doesn't work. Even though you can understand people off of being an American, But being a Texan American and a New Yorker are two very different things if you've been there. So this is where we'll drop off for today. Just a little intro. Next episode, we will be getting into verse 4, and we'll spend some time kind of figuring out who these people are, what's going on, what are these myths, genealogies, teachers of the law, and just figuring out, taking a different approach from what is typically assumed, and letting history and the language really pop out at us. It's word studies, emphasizing all of these words seems to be a little bit necessary in this approach, just because of the specific, we're finding identities of the people who we're speaking of. And once we can figure out who the antagonists are, we can start figuring out the letter and putting it all together. So shalom, everyone. Pray this was a blessing to you all. I hope you all have a wonderful night, day, whenever you're listening to this. And I hope you look forward to the next episode. I sure do. Shalom.